Welcome to the CareClinic pod. I'm Emma, and this is Jones.
Ever feel like your period pain is just different? Like
Mhm.
way worse than normal cramps? You're not imagining things. Millions of women experience this.
Right.
And it could be from adenomyosis or uterine fibroids.
You're right. And these conditions are more common than a lot of people realize. And because they share some symptoms, they often get confused. But understanding the differences is crucial for getting the right treatment.
Exactly. So let's break it down. What exactly are adenomyosis and uterine fibroids?
Okay, let's start with adenomyosis. Imagine the lining of your uterus, the tissue that sheds during your period.
Mhm.
Now, picture that tissue growing into the muscle wall of your uterus.
Oh, wow.
That's adenomyosis. It causes the uterus to enlarge and can be incredibly painful.
So it's like your uterus is turning on itself. That sounds awful. And fibroids.
Uterine fibroids are a bit different. They're benign tumors, meaning they're not cancerous, that grow in the wall of the uterus. Think of them as knots of muscle and fibrous tissue. They're actually incredibly common.
Okay.
Most women will develop them at some point in their lives.
Okay. That makes me feel a little better. But even if they're benign, both of these sound pretty unpleasant. What kind of symptoms should we be looking out for?
Well, that's the tricky part. There's a lot of overlap in symptoms, which makes self-diagnosis almost impossible. For example, both conditions can cause heavy menstrual bleeding, so heavy you might even become anemic.
Oh, wow. So you could be experiencing these symptoms and have absolutely no idea which one is the culprit.
Exactly. And the shared symptoms don't stop there. Painful periods are another big one, along with general abdominal pain and pain during intercourse.
So what are some of the unique signs of each condition? How can someone listening know if they should see a doctor?
Okay. With adenomyosis, one unique symptom is prolonged bleeding. Your periods might last much longer than usual. You could also have chronic pelvic pain, the kind that lingers even when you're not on your period. Some women even experience leg pain and blood clots.
Wow. That's a lot to deal with.
Mm.
I can see how this would impact your day-to-day life. What about fibroids? Do they have any unique giveaways?
Fibroids compress on your bladder, making you feel like you constantly have to pee. They can also sometimes cause complications during pregnancy. And although rare, they can contribute to infertility.
This all makes getting a proper diagnosis so important. I mean, how can you even begin to address these issues if you don't know what you're dealing with?
You're absolutely right. A pelvic exam is usually the first step. Your doctor will be checking for any abnormalities, like an enlarged uterus, which can be a sign of both conditions.
So the pelvic exam is kind of like a first pass. What happens if they suspect either adenomyosis or fibroids?
That's when imaging tests come into play. An ultrasound is often the next step. It uses sound waves to create images of your uterus and can often spot fibroids pretty clearly.
So ultrasound can give you a good look at what's going on in there.
Yes, and it can also pick up on things like a thickened uterine wall, which could point to adenomyosis. But it's not always foolproof. For a more detailed look, your doctor might recommend an MRI.
MRI, that's the big machine, right? Why would that be necessary?
An MRI gives a much clearer picture of your uterus. It can sometimes be the key to differentiating between adenomyosis and other conditions.
That makes sense. But earlier you mentioned it can be difficult to definitively diagnose adenomyosis. Does this relate to the need for an MRI?
It does. Here's the surprising fact. The only way to definitively diagnose adenomyosis is by examining the uterine tissue under a microscope. And often that happens after a hysterectomy.
Wait, so you have to have your uterus removed to know for sure if you have adenomyosis. That seems pretty intense.
It is a significant procedure, and it highlights the complexity of diagnosing this condition. Doctors often make a presumptive diagnosis based on symptoms and imaging, but that microscopic examination provides absolute certainty.
So for anyone listening who is worried they might have either of these conditions, the takeaway here is to talk to your doctor.
Absolutely. And remember, you can track your symptoms and learn more using the CareClinic app. It's so important to advocate for your health. If you suspect something's wrong, don't hesitate to talk to your doctor.
Right. And speaking of talking to your doctor, let's dig deeper into that diagnosis process. What can someone expect when they go in with these kinds of symptoms?
Well, your doctor will first want to get a detailed understanding of what you've been experiencing. So expect a lot of questions about your symptoms, how severe they are, and how long you've been dealing with them.
So being prepared to give detailed information is key.
Absolutely. The more your doctor knows, the better they can understand your situation. And of course, a pelvic exam is usually part of the initial assessment. It helps the doctor check for any physical signs, like an enlarged or tender uterus.
And if those initial checks raise red flags, what happens next?
That's when we turn to imaging tests to get a clearer picture. An ultrasound is usually the first line of defense. It's a simple, painless way to visualize your uterus and check for fibroids.
So an ultrasound can reveal quite a bit.
It can. And for adenomyosis, it can show if your uterine wall is thicker than normal, which is a potential sign. But remember, ultrasounds don't tell the whole story, especially with adenomyosis.
You mentioned MRI before. Is that where that comes in?
Exactly. If more detail is needed, an MRI can provide a much clearer view of your uterus and surrounding tissues.
So it's a more powerful tool for getting to the bottom of things.
That's right. An MRI can often help distinguish between adenomyosis and other conditions. But keep in mind, as we talked about earlier, the only definitive diagnosis for adenomyosis comes from examining tissue under a microscope, which often means after a hysterectomy.
That's a good reminder. And it reinforces why open communication with your doctor is so crucial. They can help you navigate the diagnostic process and understand the implications of each step.
I couldn't agree more. It's a partnership. Now, once you have a diagnosis, the next step is figuring out the best way to manage it. Let's talk about treatment options, starting with adenomyosis.
Okay, so let's say you've been diagnosed with adenomyosis. What can you do to get some relief?
Pain management is usually the first priority. Over-the-counter pain relievers, like ibuprofen or naproxen, can be helpful for managing cramps and discomfort. If those aren't enough, your doctor might prescribe something stronger.
And what about the heavy bleeding that's so common with adenomyosis? Are there ways to control that?
Absolutely. Hormonal therapies, like birth control pills or hormonal IUDs, can work wonders. They help regulate your periods and lighten the bleeding.
So it's about bringing those hormones back into balance.
Exactly. And for some women, that's enough to significantly improve their quality of life. But sometimes more intervention is needed.
What are some of the options if those initial treatments aren't enough?
One option is endometrial ablation. It's a procedure that removes or destroys the lining of your uterus.
So you're essentially removing the source of the bleeding.
That's the idea. And for many women, it drastically reduces or even eliminates their periods. But it's important to note that this isn't a good option if you're still hoping to have children.
Makes sense. Now, I've also heard about uterine artery embolization being used for fibroids. Can that also be used for adenomyosis?
You're right. Uterine artery embolization, or UAE, is mainly used for fibroids, but it can be an option for adenomyosis in certain cases. It involves blocking blood flow to the uterus, which can shrink the affected tissue and relieve symptoms.
So it's like cutting off the supply line.
Exactly. But it's important to understand that UAE can also affect your fertility. It's not a decision to be made lightly.
It sounds like fertility is a major consideration with many of these treatments.
It absolutely is. That's why having that honest, open conversation with your doctor is so essential. They can help you weigh the pros and cons based on your individual circumstances and goals. Now let's shift gears and talk about fibroid treatment.
Okay, so for women diagnosed with fibroids, what are their options?
Similar to adenomyosis, we often start with managing pain and using hormonal therapy to control bleeding and shrink the fibroids. But for some women, these measures aren't sufficient, especially if the fibroids are large or causing significant problems.
So what are the alternatives if those first-line treatments don't cut it?
One option is a myomectomy, which is a surgical procedure to remove the fibroids while leaving your uterus intact.
So you're essentially just taking out the troublesome fibroids.
Precisely. This is often the preferred choice for women who still want to have children because it preserves their fertility. Of course, it is surgery, so there are risks and a recovery period involved.
And you mentioned some minimally invasive procedures earlier, like uterine fibroid embolization and myolysis. What can you tell us about those?
Those are great options for many women because they offer the benefits of treatment without the invasiveness of surgery. Uterine fibroid embolization, or UFE, works just like UAE for adenomyosis. It blocks the blood flow to the fibroids, causing them to shrink.
So same concept, different target.
Exactly. And then there's myolysis, which uses heat freezing or radiofrequency energy to destroy the fibroids.
It seems like these less invasive procedures are becoming more common. What are the advantages?
Well, they typically mean less pain, faster recovery, and fewer complications compared to traditional surgery. And the best part, they can be just as effective at relieving symptoms.
That's fantastic. It really highlights how medical technology is advancing and offering women more options than ever before.
Absolutely. And speaking of options, don't forget about the CareClinic app. It's a wonderful resource for staying organized with your healthcare, tracking your symptoms and researching treatments.
That's such a good point. Having all that information at your fingertips can be incredibly empowering. But even with all these advances, there are still times when nothing seems to work right.
Unfortunately, that's true. In some cases, especially when symptoms are severe and other treatments have failed, a hysterectomy might be the best course of action.
And that's the removal of the uterus.
Yes, either partially or completely, depending on the situation. It's a major decision. But it can provide lasting relief from the pain and bleeding caused by these conditions. Of course, it also means that you won't be able to have children.
That's a huge consideration. It really underscores the importance of weighing all your options carefully with your doctor's guidance and making the choice that's right for you. But before we wrap up this part of our conversation, I think it's important to address some of the misconceptions surrounding adenomyosis and fibroids. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and I think it's important to set the record straight.
I agree. There are a lot of myths and half-truths floating around. For instance, a common one is that all fibroids are painful. In reality, many women have fibroids and don't even realize it because they experience no symptoms at all.
So you could be living with fibroids and have absolutely no idea.
That's right. It all depends on the size and location of the fibroids. Some grow quite large and cause problems, while others stay small and silent.
Another misconception I've encountered is that adenomyosis is just a type of endometriosis. Is there any truth to that?
While they share some similarities, they're actually quite different. Endometriosis is when tissue similar to the lining of the uterus grows outside the uterus, whereas adenomyosis is when it grows into the muscular wall.
So same type of tissue, different location, different condition.
Exactly. And that difference is crucial because it affects both symptoms and treatment approaches.
This is all so insightful.
Yeah.
Okay, last myth to bust. Does having a hysterectomy automatically mean you'll go through menopause?
Not necessarily. If your ovaries are removed along with your uterus, then yes, you'll enter menopause because your body will stop producing estrogen. But if your ovaries are left intact, your hormones will continue to cycle normally. You just won't have periods anymore since there's no uterus to shed lining.
That's an important distinction, and it's just a glimpse into the complexities of these conditions. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much more to discuss. We've talked a lot about the physical aspects of adenomyosis and fibroids, but I know there's a huge emotional component to these conditions as well. It's not just about the physical pain, but also the impact it can have on your life, your relationships, even your mental health.
Absolutely. Living with chronic pain and discomfort can take a toll on every aspect of your well-being. It can affect your work, your social life, your intimacy, and even your sense of self.
It's so important to acknowledge that it's not just about finding the right treatment for the physical symptoms, but also finding ways to cope with the emotional burden.
Exactly. And that's why connecting with others who understand what you're going through can be so invaluable. Support groups, online forums, even just talking to a trusted friend or family member can make a world of difference. Remember, you're not alone in this.
Speaking of connecting, let's dive into some of the questions we've received from our listeners. One that comes up frequently is about fertility. A lot of women are concerned about how adenomyosis and fibroids might impact their ability to get pregnant.
It's a valid concern, and as we touched on earlier, the impact on fertility can vary greatly depending on the individual case. Both conditions can pose challenges, but many women with adenomyosis or fibroids go on to have healthy pregnancies.
So it's not an automatic roadblock to motherhood.
Not at all. But it's definitely something to be aware of and discuss with your doctor, especially if you're planning a pregnancy or having trouble conceiving.
What about menopause? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel for women with these conditions?
For many women with adenomyosis, menopause can bring significant relief. Since adenomyosis is estrogen-driven, when estrogen levels naturally decline after menopause, the symptoms often lessen or disappear completely.
So menopause can be a turning point for the better.
For many, yes. And fibroids also tend to shrink after menopause for the same reason. However, it's not a guaranteed cure-all. Some fibroids may persist or even continue to grow even after menopause.
I see. So while menopause can offer hope, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. And it's crucial to continue monitoring your health and working with your doctor to manage any lingering symptoms.
Now, I know a lot of women are wondering if there's anything they can do to prevent adenomyosis or fibroids in the first place. Is there a magic formula to avoid these conditions?
Unfortunately, there's no surefire way to prevent either one. We still don't fully understand what causes them, which makes prevention tricky.
So no special diet or lifestyle changes that will guarantee a fibroid-free future.
I wish it were that simple. But taking care of your overall health is always a good strategy. Maintaining a healthy weight, eating a balanced diet, and managing stress can contribute to a healthy uterus, even if it doesn't completely eliminate the risk.
That makes sense. It's about creating a healthy environment within your body.
Exactly. And speaking of a healthy environment, the CareClinic app is a fantastic tool for taking control of your health journey. It can help you track your symptoms, research treatment options, and connect with a supportive community.
It's like having a personal health advocate right at your fingertips.
Exactly.
Before we wrap up, let's address one final question that weighs heavily on many minds. What are the long-term risks associated with adenomyosis and fibroids?
As we mentioned earlier, one of the primary concerns with adenomyosis is a slightly increased risk of endometrial and thyroid cancers. While it's not a certainty, it's something to be mindful of and discuss with your doctor, especially when it comes to regular checkups and screenings.
So vigilance and early detection are key.
Absolutely. And when it comes to fibroids, the good news is that they're almost always benign. The risk of them becoming cancerous is extremely low.
That's reassuring. But even though they're benign, they can still cause complications, right?
That's right. Large fibroids can lead to issues like persistent pelvic pain, bladder pressure, and even bowel obstruction. So even though they're not cancerous, it's still essential to monitor them and seek treatment if they're causing problems or growing rapidly.
It sounds like the key takeaway here is to be proactive about your health. Listen to your body, pay attention to any changes, and don't hesitate to reach out to your doctor if something feels off.
I couldn't agree more. Early intervention and open communication with your healthcare provider can make a world of difference in managing these conditions and living a full, vibrant life.
This has been such an enlightening conversation. I feel like we've shed light on some often misunderstood conditions and empowered our listeners to take control of their uterine health.
That's what we aim for. Knowledge is power. And the more you understand about adenomyosis and fibroids, the better equipped you'll be to advocate for yourself and make informed decisions about your care.
And remember, you are not alone in this journey. There are countless resources available to support you, including the CareClinic app, which can provide valuable information tracking tools and a sense of community.
Exactly. And as always, if you're experiencing any of the symptoms we've discussed, don't hesitate to reach out to your healthcare provider. There are effective treatments available, and you deserve to live a life free from pain and discomfort.
Thank you for joining us for this episode on adenomyosis and uterine fibroids. We hope you found this information helpful and empowering. Until next time, take care of yourselves and be well.